The morning she walked into that dusty general store, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Her two small children were clinging to her skirt, their eyes wide and scared. Everyone stopped what they were doing. The men playing cards in the corner went silent. The air grew thick. She placed a single worn coin on the wooden counter. Just one. Her voice trembled when she spoke, but every soul in that room heard her clear as a bell. "I need to buy a beam," she said. "Just one." The shopkeeper, a man with a sour face and even sourer heart, looked at the coin. Then he looked at her, and then he burst out laughing. It was a cruel, ugly sound that echoed off the shelves of flour and nails. The men at the card table joined in, their chuckles like stones rattling in a can. "That won't even buy you a handful of nails, widow," one of them sneered. "That's not a payment. That's just charity you're too proud to call by its name." Her face flushed a deep, painful red. Shame burned in her cheeks. She tried to explain. She told them she'd pay the rest with work. She could mend clothes, scrub floors, anything. She just needed one piece of wood, one beam to raise the wall that had fallen in her cabin, so her children wouldn't have to sleep under the cold night rain. But the shopkeeper wasn't listening. He flicked the coin with his finger, sending it spinning back across the counter toward her. "Poor widows belong at the church door, begging," he spat. "Not in my store, wasting my time." The laughter died. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. You could have heard a feather drop. And then another sound broke it. The sound of heavy boots walking from the back of the store, firm, steady. Each step was like a hammer blow. A man emerged from the shadows. He was huge, a mountain of a man with a thick, dark beard and shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world. He'd clearly spent years hauling logs alone in the deep woods, and it showed. He didn't say a word. He walked right up to the counter, his eyes fixed on the rejected coin. With fingers as thick as branches and calloused from a lifetime of hard labor, he picked it up. He held it under the dim light, turning it over as if it were a rare jewel. The entire store watched, mesmerized. Then he spoke, and his voice was a deep rumble, like thunder rolling down from the high peaks. "50 cents is enough," he said. The words shook the very dust from the rafters. He looked from the coin to the shopkeeper, his gaze like chips of flint. "It's enough," he repeated, "if I pay the rest with my name." The murmuring stopped cold. Every eye in the place was locked on him. The stranger laid his scarred, powerful hand over the coin on the counter. Then he reached out and placed that same hand gently on the widow's shoulder. It wasn't just a touch. It felt like he was sealing a sacred pact, right there in front of God and everyone. Without asking permission, without another word, he turned. He walked over to a stack of lumber, and he lifted the heaviest, thickest beam in the entire store. He swung it onto his massive shoulder as if it were a mere twig. The wood probably weighed more than the woman and her two children combined, but he carried it like it was nothing. He turned and forced his way through the stunned, silent crowd, who parted for him like the Red Sea. The woman, tears finally breaking free and burning tracks down her dusty cheeks, hugged her children tight. She followed him out into the harsh midday sun, clutching the coin in her palm. It no longer felt like a token of her shame. Now it felt like a medal of honor, a symbol of a dignity she thought she had lost forever. Outside, the man stopped. The sun beat down on them, relentless. He didn't look at her directly. His eyes were on the distant mountains. "A cabin is raised with hands," he said, his voice rough as bark. "Not with coins. Show me where yours is." She could only nod, her voice choked with tears. As they started down the overgrown path that led into the valley, the whispers of the town followed them, a river of disbelief and suspicion. Some said it was madness, others whispered it might be mercy. but every single person who watched them go knew they had just witnessed something powerful, something that couldn't be bought with all the gold in the world or with 100 wooden beams. That path into the valley was wild and choked with weeds, a clear sign that almost no one ever traveled it. It was a forgotten place for forgotten people. The woman walked ahead, her children still attached to her skirt, like burrs. Behind her, the mountain man followed, the heavy beam resting easily on his shoulder, his steady, thudding footsteps like the beat of a drum, announcing the start of something new and unknown. When they finally reached the place she called home, it wasn't a cabin. It was a skeleton, a ghost of a house. The walls were crooked and leaning, the roof had caved in, and stones from the chimney were scattered across the ground like broken teeth. It looked more like a grave than a home. It looked like a place where hope had come to die. The woman couldn't meet the stranger's eyes. She looked down at the dirt, her voice a barely audible murmur of shame. She explained that this was where she and her husband had spent their last happy days, before the sickness came and stole him from her. After he was gone, she said, the house just seemed to give up, surrendering to the wind and the rain, as if the world itself was trying to erase her and her children from existence. The man didn't say a word. He just lowered the heavy beam to the ground with a soft thud. He knelt by the crumbling foundations, pressing his fingers into the soil, testing it, like a doctor examining a deep and painful wound. He was silent for a long time. Then he rose. He pulled a sharp, well-used axe from his belt, and without any ceremony began to clear the tangled branches and debris away from the ruin. The sharp, rhythmic thwack of his axe echoed through the quiet valley, a lonely, defiant sound. The children, who had been hiding behind their mother, slowly crept closer, their fear replaced by a wide-eyed, innocent curiosity. They watched him work, his muscles bunching and releasing with each powerful swing. Finally, the little boy, the braver of the two, spoke up. "Can you really fix a house that's so broken?" he asked. The man stopped his work. He paused, axe in hand, and looked down at the two small faces staring up at him. His eyes were weary, filled with a sadness that seemed ancient, but they were also incredibly steady. "Everything can be mended," he said, his deep voice softer now, "if you start with the heart." He then pointed a thick finger at the coin the woman was still clutching tightly in her fist. "That," he added, his gaze intense, "is more than just iron. It is a promise." The woman was stunned. She hadn't expected him to say so much. His words were like a balm, soothing the raw, cracked places in her own heart. A strange warmth spread through her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. It felt as if his very words were stitching her broken world back together. They worked for the rest of the day, a silent, determined team. They gathered usable timber from the collapse, their hands straining to lift the heavy, waterlogged pieces of what was once a home. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the man took the beam he had carried all the way from town. He placed it with the care and reverence of a priest, placing a cornerstone for a new church, securing it with old ropes and the sheer force of his own body. He made it the new backbone of the house. Exhausted and breathless, the woman offered him a bowl of water. He took it, drank deeply, and bowed his head in a silent gesture of thanks. No words were needed. In that quiet moment, she understood that his silent gratitude was more profound than 1,000 flowery phrases. That night, under a vast, star-dusted sky, they lit a small fire in front of the half-raised cabin. The children, worn out from the day, fell asleep curled up in each other's arms. The woman sat and watched the firelight dance across the stranger's face, illuminating the deep lines and scars that told a story of solitude and hardship. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she wasn't afraid of the dawn. She knew the house was still broken, the work was far from over, But she also knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that something new and strong was being raised right alongside its walls, and it wasn't just made of wood. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. The valley, once silent and dead, was now filled with the sounds of life. The steady bang, bang, bang of a hammer driving nails, the groan of logs being hoisted into place, and most importantly, the sound of children's laughter, bright and clear, echoing through the trees. The mountain man was a force of nature, raising the walls with the raw strength of his arms. But the children had their own part to play. They ran about like busy little ants, gathering stones for the new chimney. They picked wildflowers and tucked them into the cracks in the new walls, decorating their rising home with crowns of color. The woman, who had never held a tool in her life, found a new kind of strength in her own hands. She learned to hold nails steady, her fingers trembling at first, while the man guided her hand with the hammer. He was patient, showing her where to set the wood, how to secure the angles to make them strong. They didn't talk much at first. Their communication was in the shared work, the silent understanding of a task that needed to be done. But slowly, as the walls grew higher, words began to fill the spaces between the hammer blows. During their brief rests, they started to share stories. She told him about her childhood on a faraway ranch. She told him how her father used to say that 50 cents was enough to start anything in this world, as long as you had faith to go with it. He, in turn, after long, thoughtful silences, confessed his own story. He told her he had lived alone in the mountains for years, that the war and then a brutal winter had taken his family from him. He admitted that he had learned to speak more with the trees than with men. Each story they shared was like another stone being carefully placed in an invisible wall they were building between them. A wall of trust. It grew stronger every day, right alongside the cabin. At dusk, after the children were asleep by the fire, he would often pull out his knife. With slow, deliberate movements, he would carve small figures from scraps of wood, a perfect little horse, a bird with its wings spread wide, a crescent moon. He would finish one, inspect it, and then simply hand it to her without a word. She accepted them in silence, but her heart knew. These small, simple carvings were gifts more precious than any amount of gold or silver. They were pieces of his guarded soul. One night, a fierce rainstorm blew through the valley. The roof was only half finished, and water began to drip through a gap, splashing onto the floor. Without even thinking, the woman grabbed a bucket, climbed onto a rickety chair, and held it up to catch the leak. The man, watching her from the shadows, smiled. It was a rare, faint smile that barely touched his lips, but lit up his eyes. "You are no longer a widow who waits," he murmured, his voice low. "You are a woman who builds." She felt a blush creep up her neck. His words were stronger and more meaningful than any compliment she had ever received in her entire life. That 50-cent coin, the one that had started it all, stayed wrapped in a small piece of cloth by the hearth. Every time she looked at it, it seemed to grow. It was no longer just a piece of metal. It was a monument to her journey from shame to dignity. Day by day, the house was transforming. It was shedding its skin as a ruin and starting to breathe again, to feel like a home. And it wasn't just them who noticed. Occasionally, folks from town would wander down the overgrown path, their curiosity getting the better of them. And in their eyes the woman saw a change. The mockery was gone. In its place was a quiet, grudging respect for the widow and the stranger, who, with nothing but patience and strength, were bringing life back to a place that had been dead. But respect wasn't the only thing brewing in town. Something else was coming. Something darker. The murmurs from town traveled faster than a man on horseback. They arrived in the valley long before the new stones they needed for the chimney. While the woman and the mountain man worked in their peaceful, silent bubble, the town was buzzing like a disturbed hornet's nest. In the tavern, over mugs of ale, the whispers started. It was improper, they said. A widow, alone in the valley with a strange man. It was indecent. Rebuilding a house with an outsider, a man with no name and no history. It was a scandal. 50 cents, they scoffed, couldn't possibly cover that much shame. Some of the townswomen clucked their tongues and said she was setting a terrible example for their own daughters. The men just laughed, making crude jokes, assuring each other that the rebuilt cabin would soon turn into a den of sin. The woman heard the rumors for the first time when she went to the town well to fetch water. The words hit her like stones, and a tight, painful knot formed in her chest. She realized with a sickening lurch that while the walls of her home were rising strong and true, the walls of her reputation were being torn down piece by piece. She returned to the valley with a heavy heart. She found the man splitting logs, the axe rising and falling in a powerful, steady rhythm. In a low, trembling voice, she asked him if she should just give up, if she should take her children and leave, run away before the town's gossip poisoned their lives forever. He stopped, the axe frozen in midair. He turned and looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her fear and into her soul. "The wind speaks," he said, his voice a low rumble, "but it does not topple a trunk that is rooted." He walked over to the hearth, picked up the small cloth bundle, and unwrapped the coin. He placed it back in her palm, his rough fingers closing hers around it. "This was your payment," he said firmly, "but it was also your courage. Never give it back." That night, as the rain beat down on the newly nailed roof boards, his words echoed in her mind. They felt like new, strong beams, holding up the weight of her fear, the weight that was threatening to crush her. The very next morning they went to the market for more nails, and that's when the tension exploded from whispers into a public spectacle. As they approached the general store, a man stepped out to block their path. It was her late husband's brother. His face was twisted with anger. He raised his voice, shouting so that everyone in the town square could hear his accusations. "That cabin is not yours," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at her. "That land is bound by family debt. You have no right. And no stranger," he sneered, looking the mountain man up and down with contempt, "and no worthless copper coin can give you any rights." A crowd gathered instantly like flies to honey. The air filled with a mixture of nervous laughter and angry accusations. Some people shouted that a lone woman could never claim a roof for herself. The widow trembled, clutching her youngest son's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. For a terrifying second, she thought about dropping the coin, about surrendering, just to make it all stop. But then the mountain man stepped forward. He moved between her and the angry crowd. He took the coin from her trembling hand and held it up high so the sunlight glinted off its worn surface. He held it up for everyone to see. His voice boomed across the square, silencing the mob. "She paid," he declared, his voice like cracking stone. "And I finish the price with my name. No one can erase what is already written." The brother-in-law's face went purple with rage. He knew he'd lost this round, but as he stormed away, he screamed a promise over his shoulder, a promise that this was far from over. The sun was high and hot in the sky when the brother-in-law made his next move. He wasn't just shouting in the street anymore. He had a plan. He gathered half the town in front of the church, right after the Sunday service let out. He stood on the steps, clutching a thick roll of official-looking papers. He proclaimed to the crowd that he had the proof. Proof that the land, the cabin, everything on it, belonged to him by blood inheritance. He shook the documents in the air like a whip. He shouted that a widow had no right to raise walls without her family's consent. And she certainly couldn't do it with the help of some nameless, godless stranger from the woods. His voice dripped with self-righteous fury. He declared that everything she and the stranger had built would be his by dawn. And as for her children, They were nothing more than trespassers on sacred family ground. The crowd murmured, a sea of conflicted faces. Some people nodded and applauded him, agreeing that the law was the law and it was on his side. Others stood silent, their faces troubled, clearly uneasy with the sheer cruelty in his words. The woman stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She clutched her children's hands, and the 50-cent coin in her pocket suddenly felt heavier than a boulder. Everything they had worked for, every nail, every beam, every drop of sweat, it could all be torn away in an instant. Just then, the mountain man moved. He strode through the parted crowd, right up to the church steps. He didn't say a word. He simply snatched the papers from the brother-in-law's hand. He held them high for a moment, letting everyone get a good look. Then, with a slow, deliberate gesture, he walked to a torch burning by the church entrance. He thrust the papers into the flame. The crowd gasped as the fire caught, curling the edges of the documents, turning the ink and paper to black, fluttering ash. "No paper holds more value than the life already built here," the mountain man said, his voice a low thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. He turned his burning gaze on the brother-in-law and then to the crowd. "She paid with the little she had, and I gave what remained of me. My name." He pointed to his own chest. "That does not burn." The crowd erupted. It was chaos. Some people screamed that he was a barbarian, a lawless animal for scorning a legal document. But others, a growing number, started to cheer. They cheered for his raw courage, for his fierce defense of the widow. The brother-in-law was practically foaming at the mouth with rage. He shrieked that he would be back. He would bring the sheriff. He swore that the cabin would be torn down with axes if it had to be. The woman trembled, the world spinning around her. But then the mountain man did something that changed everything. In front of the entire town, he took her hand in his. He lifted it high, opening her palm to reveal the small, bright coin nestled there. A reverent, awe-filled silence fell over the crowd. Even the angriest voices went quiet. In that moment, a few of the town elders were heard to murmur that they had never, in all their long years, seen a pact sealed in such a strange and powerful way. A worthless coin had been transformed, right before their eyes, into an unbreakable promise. That night, as an uneasy quiet settled over the valley, the woman finally understood. This was no longer just a fight for a house. It was a battle for her right to exist, to live with dignity. And she realized with a chilling certainty that half the town was still standing against her. The fire by the church had died down, but in the glowing embers of those burned papers, a new fire had been lit. The spark of a destiny from which there was no turning back. The next morning, the sharp, rhythmic clatter of horse hooves cut through the morning mist. The sheriff had arrived. He dismounted in front of the half-finished cabin, two armed deputies flanking him. A heavy iron hammer, the kind used for demolition, hung ominously from his belt. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. His voice was as dry as dust when he spoke. He announced that he carried an official demolition order, signed and sealed at the county courthouse. The widow, he declared, must vacate the premises by sunset. If she didn't, the house would be reduced to a pile of splintered planks under his direct authority. The woman felt the ground drop out from under her. The world seemed to collapse in on itself for the second time. She clutched the coin in her fist so hard it bit into her palm, as if that small piece of copper could somehow hold back the crushing force of the law. But the mountain man stepped forward. He stood between her and the sheriff, as solid and unmovable as the mountains behind him. He possessed the quiet calm of a man who had weathered far worse storms than a piece of paper. "A paper is signed at a table," he said to the sheriff, his voice even and low. "But a life is signed in the earth. There are children who sleep beneath this roof, and I will not let them be robbed of the only thing they have." The sheriff, a man accustomed to immediate, unquestioning obedience, raised a skeptical eyebrow. "If you want to play the hero," he replied with a sneer, "you'll have to pay the family debt. Otherwise, you'll be facing a jail cell by nightfall." Without a word, the mountain man drew the long, sharp knife from his belt. In one swift motion, he drove the blade deep into the new door frame, the wood groaning in protest. The knife stood there, quivering. "My name is here," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly serious growl. "My life pays what is missing." A silence as thick as molasses spread through the clearing. The woman, holding back a sob, stepped forward. With a trembling hand, she placed her 50-cent coin on the wood of the door frame, right beside the hilt of the embedded knife. She joined the two symbols, her courage and his name, right there for all to see. The sheriff hesitated. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He knew he could execute the order. He had the men. He had the authority. But it would be messy. It could mean blood. And he didn't want the burden of dragging a mother and her children from their home on his conscience. More than that, he didn't want to meet the eyes of a man who was clearly, without a doubt, willing to die for his word. A crowd had started to gather, drawn from town by the commotion. They pressed in around the edges of the valley, their voices a rising tide of argument. Some shouted for the law to be enforced, that the cabin had to come down. Others begged for mercy, for compassion. The tension grew, stretching tighter and tighter, until it felt like the very air was about to snap. Then the woman found her voice. It trembled, but it was steady and clear, and it cut through the noise. 50 cents was all I had, she cried out. But with it I bought my dignity. And he, she said, looking at the mountain man, paid the rest with the one thing that can't be stolen from a man. His name. The sheriff's face was a mask of frustration. He pressed his lips into a thin, hard line. He snatched the papers from his jacket, looked at them, then at the knife and the coin, and then at the determined faces of the woman and the man. With a muttered curse, he shoved the papers back into his coat. "I'll be back," he snarled, "with reinforcements if I have to." He turned and left, his deputies trailing behind him. But he left behind a threat that hung in the air, heavy and dark, like a storm that had not yet broken. The woman rushed to hug her children, burying her face in their hair. The man pulled his knife from the door frame and picked up the coin. They looked at each other, and in that shared glance, a silent understanding passed between them. This was no longer about a disputed home. This was a war against a world that seemed determined to erase them completely. Dusk had barely begun to paint the mountain tops red when they came. The brother-in-law was back, and he wasn't alone. He had half a dozen rough-looking men with him, armed with heavy axes and thick ropes. They came down the path into the valley not like men, but like a pack of wolves, intent on tearing the cabin from its very foundations. Their voices echoed through the trees, filled with jeers and taunts. They shouted that no woman could defy the blood of her family, that some landless outsider couldn't stop what the law had already decided. Seeing them advance, a wave of pure terror washed over the woman. Her heart felt like it had stopped beating, but this time she didn't think of running. A new kind of fire was burning inside her. She took the 50-cent coin, held it up for her children to see, and said, her voice shaking but fierce, "This brought us here, and this will keep us here." The mountain man had been chopping firewood by the threshold. He heard the commotion, and he let his axe fall to the ground with a dull thud. He planted himself in the doorway of the cabin, his massive arms crossed over his chest. He looked like he was carved from the same rock as the mountains themselves. The firelight from inside threw his shadow long and dark across the ground. "If you want to pass," he said, his voice a low, gravelly growl, "you'll have to cross my name first." The men surged forward, their faces contorted with rage. The brother-in-law was at the front, and he raised the first axe, ready to strike the door. But before the blow could land, another sound stopped them all in their tracks. The sound of footsteps coming up the path behind them. It wasn't the sheriff. It was a small group of villagers. Not many, just a few women and two old men who had seen too much in their long lives. But they weren't empty-handed. They carried lit candles, and in the growing darkness, the small flames looked like an army of defiant stars. One of the old men, his voice cracked with age but steady with conviction, spoke into the tense silence. "I have seen too many good people crushed by injustice," he said, his eyes on the brother-in-law. "A woman who pays with the little she has deserves a roof over her head, not chains on her hands." A murmur rippled through the brother-in-law's gang of thugs. Some of them, the ones who had come just for a bit of coin, began to look uneasy. They faltered, their eyes shifting between the mountain giant in the doorway and the silent, judging lights of the candles that seemed to be growing in number by the minute. The brother-in-law roared with frustration. He tried to shove his men forward, to force them to attack. But nobody wanted to be the first. Nobody wanted to challenge the man who looked like he could break them in two, and nobody wanted to face the quiet, powerful judgment of their neighbors. Seizing the moment, the woman stepped forward. She reached up and placed the 50-cent coin on the wooden lintel above the door. She raised her voice, and it carried through the night, clear and strong. "With this, I bought my home. With this, I bought my life. If you want to take it, you'll have to tear it out with blood." A profound silence fell over the valley. It was so complete that even the chirping crickets seemed to hold their breath. The brother-in-law's face was a twisted mask of pure hatred and impotence. With a final, choked scream of rage, he threw his axe to the ground. He swore he would be back, that the sheriff and the full force of the law would be with him next time. But when he turned and stormed off into the darkness, he went alone. His hired muscle had melted away into the night. They had all begun to understand a very old, very powerful truth. That force and fury don't always win, not when a little bit of courage shines in the dark. The echo of the brother-in-law's threat hadn't even faded from the valley when, 2 days later, the sheriff made good on his promise. He returned, and this time he brought a larger posse. He held up a newly issued document declaring that he now had the official backing of the highest court in the territory to evict the widow and demolish her cabin. His voice was firm and cold, striking against the mountainside like the clang of iron hammers on an anvil. The woman, with her two small children clinging to her skirt like frightened shadows, stepped onto the threshold. Her face was pale, but her back was ramrod straight. With a steady hand, she reached up and placed the 50-cent coin on the main beam of the cabin, right where everyone could see it. It shone in the morning light like a sacred seal, a tiny shield against the coming storm. The mountain man stood beside her, a silent, unmovable guardian. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He spoke just loud enough for everyone, from the sheriff to the farthest man in the posse, to hear him. "She paid what she could," he said, his voice calm and even. "And I gave my name. This house was raised with dignity. And dignity," he added, his eyes locking with the sheriff's, "does not fall." The sheriff, his face red with irritation, barked an order for his men to advance. They took a step forward, their hands tightening on their axes and hammers. But then an unexpected sound rose from behind them, a low murmur that quickly grew into the sound of dozens of approaching people. The town had come, dozens of them. They weren't carrying weapons. They were carrying candles, even in the daylight. They carried loaves of freshly baked bread. They carried buckets of clear, cool water from the town well. They walked past the sheriff's men and placed these simple, powerful symbols of life in a line before the cabin door, creating a barricade made not of wood or stone, but of light and sustenance and community. An elderly woman, the same one who had come with the candles 2 nights before, stepped forward. Her voice was clear and rang with authority. I have seen women dragged into the dust my whole life, she declared, her gaze sweeping over the armed men. And this will not be another. A coin may not buy a stack of lumber, but it can buy respect, and this woman has earned ours. The sheriff's men hesitated. They had signed on to execute a legal order to tear down an empty building. They hadn't come to face down a united town. They hadn't come to fight their own neighbors. One of the deputies, a young man, lowered his axe. He muttered under his breath that he would not be the one to strike a wall when he knew there were children sleeping inside. The sheriff, practically vibrating with rage, tried to reassert his authority. He shouted, he threatened, but his every word was met with the profound, unbroken silence of the townspeople and the unwavering light of their candles. The sheer weight of their collective will, their silent judgment, was more powerful than any legal document. Finally, defeated, the sheriff was forced to retreat. The woman, tears of exhaustion and gratitude streaming down her face, reached up and took the coin from the beam. She held it high for everyone to see. "This isn't just copper," she cried, her voice breaking. "It is life, and with it I bought a home for my children." The town, the same town that had mocked and scorned her just days before, erupted. It started as a slow, scattered applause, but it swelled and grew until it was a thunderous roar of support that echoed off the hills, chasing the humiliated sheriff and his men from the valley. That night, the candles continued to burn in a protective circle around the cabin. Smoke from the new chimney rose straight and true toward the stars, and the woman finally understood. She was no longer a widow who waits, or even a woman who builds. She was a woman who was no longer alone. The town had finally seen what she and the mountain man had known all along, that those 50 cents represented something stronger, more real, and more binding than any law ever written on a piece of paper. But the brother-in-law was not a man who accepted defeat, and in the darkness his hatred was festering into something truly monstrous. The night lay heavy and silent over the valley. The brother-in-law, driven half-mad by his public humiliation, crept back down the path. His face was a twisted mask of rage in the moonlight. He carried a single burning torch. If he couldn't have the cabin, if he couldn't have power over the widow, then he would see it all reduced to ash. He was determined to burn the shame of his defeat from the face of the earth. His steps were quiet on the damp grass, but every snapped twig seemed to scream a warning of the tragedy to come. Inside the cabin, the woman and her children were asleep, exhausted from the emotional turmoil of the day. But the mountain man was awake. He stood by the small window, a silent sentinel watching the darkness. He had a feeling, a deep primal sense, that the threat was not yet over. When he saw the first flicker of orange light dancing between the trees, he didn't rush outside. He simply took his knife from his belt and went to the threshold. He stood there, firm and waiting. He seemed to know, somehow, that this final battle wouldn't be won with fists or blades, but with the simple truth that had already been etched into the very earth of that valley. The brother-in-law stumbled into the clearing, his eyes wild. He raised the torch high, the flames casting crazed shadows that danced around him. "The family's shame must be erased with fire," he shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria. "No coin and no nameless bastard can cleanse the disgrace of a woman who defies her own blood." His terrible words ripped through the quiet night, waking the woman with a jolt of fear. She scrambled from her cot and rushed to the door, the 50-cent coin clutched in her palm. She emerged into the torchlight and held the coin up, its copper surface glowing like a tiny, defiant star against the encroaching darkness. "This gave me a roof," she said, her voice broken but steady. Her eyes locked on his. "If you want to burn it, you will also have to burn the only memory you have left of your own brother." The brother-in-law faltered. Her words struck him like a physical blow. In them he heard the echo of his own lost blood, the ghost of the brother he had wronged even in death. The mountain man stepped forward, his voice calm and deadly. "You do not defend honor," he said. "You defend your own empty pride. Your brother lives on in his children, not in your worthless papers." Just then the townspeople, alerted by the telltale glow of fire in the valley, began to arrive. They came down the path once more, their candles lit, forming a silent, luminous circle around the terrible scene. Surrounded, trapped in a ring of light and judgment, the brother-in-law stood trembling. The torch felt heavy in his hand. He looked from the woman's face to the mountain man's, and then to the dozens of pairs of eyes that stared at him with nothing but scorn and contempt. He couldn't do it. He couldn't cast the flame. With a choked sob, the fire seemed to die in his spirit. It sputtered and hissed in the damp night air, leaving behind only a trail of smoke and a profound, ringing silence. Broken, he dropped the torch into the mud. Without another word, he turned and fled, disappearing into the blackness of the trees like a phantom. The woman's strength finally gave out. Tears of relief streamed down her cheeks. She walked to the threshold and placed the coin upon it. The mountain man came and laid his huge calloused hand over hers, his touch gentle, sealing their victory with a silent, eternal promise. The townspeople, witnessing this final act, broke their silence. A solemn, respectful applause rose into the night air, and the light from their many candles illuminated the small, humble cabin, making it look, for all the world, like a sacred temple. When dawn broke, it was over a clear, peaceful sky. The little cabin, which had survived mockery, legal threats, and fire, stood proudly in the valley. It was more than just a house now. It was a testament to resilience, a monument to a promise kept. The woman stepped out onto the threshold, her children by her side. She held the 50-cent coin between her fingers. She raised it to the morning sun, not as if offering a piece of copper, but as if she were offering up the entire story of her struggle, her pain, and her ultimate triumph. The mountain man, who had been silent and watchful since the night of the fire, walked forward slowly. He gently took the coin from her hand. Then he did something no one expected. He took a hammer and a single nail. With one sharp, decisive strike, he fastened the coin to the main beam above the door. He nailed it right there, in the center, so that anyone who ever entered or left that home would have to pass under its symbol. "Here is our price," he said, his voice low but carrying with perfect clarity in the morning air. "Here is our promise." The children, seeing the shiny coin above their door, clapped their small hands with delight. The townspeople, who had gathered once more in the valley, stood in reverent silence. They understood. This wasn't just an act of construction. It was a consecration. An old woman was heard to murmur that she had never seen a house raised with so little money, and yet with something so incredibly precious. A few of the men, the same men who had laughed at the widow in the store, now bowed their heads in a gesture of profound respect. The woman, tears of pure joy now falling onto the scars of her exhaustion, looked at the man. She looked at his strong, kind face, and then at the sturdy roof over their heads. And she realized it was no longer just a shelter from the rain. It was the bond that tied them all together. She stepped closer to him. She took his rough, scarred hand in hers, and in a voice loud enough for the whole town to hear, she said, "I paid with the little I had. And you," she said, her eyes locking with his, "gave everything you were. That is enough. That is enough to call it family." A rare, true smile finally broke across the mountain man's face. It was a smile filled with the gentle hardness that only comes from surviving alone for too long. "Then there is no debt," he replied softly, "because we are already the same." The crowd erupted in cheers. The children ran laughing around their new, safe home. Smoke from the chimney rose in a straight, steady column into the blue sky, a clear sign that life, against all odds, would go on. That afternoon, when the golden sun slanted through the trees, gilding the new beams of the cabin, the woman took a knife and carved their initials into the doorframe, right below the coin. And all the neighbors, all the people who had watched this incredible story unfold, they understood. Something new had been born in that valley, something that no law, no fire, and no amount of hatred could ever erase. The coin, fastened high above the door, shone like a small domestic star, a constant reminder to everyone that even the smallest, most insignificant thing can sustain an entire universe, as long as it is paid for with courage and with love. And so the story was told for generations to come, throughout that valley and beyond. The story of a widow who bought her dignity with 50 cents, and of a mountain man who paid the rest with the only thing he had left to give, his name. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of courage from the forgotten pages of history. Let me know in the comments. If you had been there that day watching that 50-cent coin get nailed above the door, what would you have thought was the true price of that home?